Yes, we're studying a small little topic, the history of the world, as we find in the Bible. Now, the Bible is not a history textbook. The Bible is a history, though. The Bible is redemptive history, a history of human redemption. But in that history of redemption, the amazing thing is there's a lot of information about history that is missing from accepted history. Now, the beauty of this is, whenever the Bible gives us information about history that is not found in accepted history, there's always a great spiritual lesson there. That's what we'll find today. One of the things that's missing in world history is a very simple thing, and it's the origins of nations, the origins of ethnic groups, what we call races. Human history can't give us the answer to those origins. For example, what was the first civilization we've been seeing the past few weeks? Accepted human history says it was the Sumerians. And they're correct. But they don't know where they came from. Just pop, all of a sudden the Sumerians are there. They speculate that there must have been Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal. There must have been a time when they moved from Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. And let me point again, the fossil record is there. But they cannot account for how the Sumerians got there. It's just pop, they're there. Well, the Bible tells where they came from. That's the line of Cain, the son of Adam. Well, then, in accepted history, we move from the Sumerians. And then, in world history, all of a sudden, very quickly, about 7500 BC, there are three civilizations that are flourishing. Egypt and Babylon and Phoenicia. That's where we get our alphabet. So about 7500 BC, all of a sudden there are three flourishing civilizations. Egypt, Babylon, Phoenicia. It's just like pop, they're there. They don't know where they came from. And they say they don't know where they came from. The Bible tells where they came from. And that's where we're going to go today, to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 is one of those passages where you tend to skip over it. I mean, I'm sorry. You come to a text like, the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshach and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. The sons of Jovan were Elisha and Tash. A whole chapter just full of names. I'm sorry, but when I'm thinking about verses to memorize, I don't go to passages like that. In fact, I'm very tempted just to skip over that, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. What we just have here in Genesis 10, it's got to be one of the most amazing historical documents of all time. It's a gold mine. There's information about the history of the world here we don't find anywhere else, literally anywhere else. Genesis chapter 10, we have the origin of every nation, every ethnic group, every civilization that ever in the whole world. Origin of every civilization, and this Genesis chapter 10 fills in those gaps of accepted world history. Those pops. There's Babylon, there's Egypt, there's Phoenicia. The Bible tells exactly where they came from. In fact, you can find yourself in this chapter. It's called the Table of Nations. The author was obviously Moses, about 1450 BC. But chapter 10 of Genesis had to be directly communicated from God. Some of Moses' other writings, well, when he wrote the book of Genesis, as we've seen before, he took documents written by Adam and written by Shem, transmitted down to Methuselah. Methuselah gave him those tablets. Noah took them on the ark. Moses used them to write the book of Genesis. Chapter 10 has to be different. God just had to directly communicate all this information to Moses, and that's because the perspective of the author of Genesis 10 is from a bird's eye view of the whole world. Like there's someone looking down on the whole world with omniscience, tracing where everybody went. And no human being in the year 1450 BC could have possibly done that. Could have possibly known all the things that were happening throughout the whole world that we see in Genesis chapter 10. As we've been seeing, you cannot possibly understand human history without understanding the flood, the Noahic covenant. There's no way to understand human history without the Table of Nations. It's too bad it's very neglected. So actually we're going to pick up at the end of Genesis chapter 9. It's just after the flood. God has destroyed the mutant hybrid race of demons And there are only 8 human beings left after the flood. Genesis 9:18-19. Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So, Genesis 10, we have 3 brothers who come out of the ark, and today there are about 6.8 billion people, 6.8 billion people in the world, and every one of them came from one of these 3 brothers. As a prelude to Genesis chapter 10, Noah gives predictions for the families of his 3 sons. He says, here's what's going to happen to you, the families of you 3 boys. Now, I'm going to look at his prediction for them, but it'll be very enigmatic. So I'm going to look at what he predicted for the 3 families, but knowing that it won't make sense to us until we go to Genesis 10 and see how it was worked out in history, which we'll do this week and next week. Here's the first prediction Noah made for the family of his son Shem. Genesis 9:26, he said, "Blessed be the Lord." Whenever we see the word Lord in all capitals, remember what that means? Yahweh, the God of Shem. So he's saying, the family of Shem would guard the knowledge of Yahweh. Who is Yahweh? Well, the world knows God as Elohim, the Creator. Shem would know Him as Yahweh. That's His personal name. That means that is the covenant-keeping God. Yahweh is the God of a personal relationship. Yahweh is the God who sends the Messiah. So Yahweh is the God of personal salvation. He says, Shem, the family of Shem, will have that knowledge. Genesis 9:26, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem." The family of Shem would guard the knowledge of Yahweh. Here's a prediction for the second brother. Now there's a bad textual error. It says, "Let Canaan be his servant." It says, "Let Ham be his servant." And the word servant is a terrible word. It sounds demeaning. I struggle with what the word was. A friend of mine suggested a word. I agree the word is designer. And that's a concept we'll explore probably next time. His personal designer. Ham, the family of Ham, was to provide a very high design services for the family of Shem, who would guard the knowledge of Yahweh. I know these are kind of enigmatic. These will make sense as we develop the chapter. Now we go to the third brother. Genesis 9:27. "May God enlarge Japheth." The family of Japheth would be, the word enlarge means, would gradually increase. It means gradually increase over the face of the earth. That would be the family of Japheth. "And let him dwell in the tents of Shem." What is Shem? The family of Shem would guard the knowledge of Yahweh. The tents of Shem would be the place of knowledge of Yahweh. So he's saying that the family of Japheth will spread over the whole earth, gradually increase, but he will do so only through the revelation of Yahweh, the personal God of salvation, as revealed by his brother Shem. Make sense so far? And then he repeats. Yes, he repeats, "And let Ham be his personal designer." So, here's the relationship God envisioned for the 3 families of man. The family of Shem would guard the knowledge of God as Savior. The family of Japheth would be enlarged upon the earth as he lived in the knowledge of the God Yahweh as revealed by the family of Shem. And Ham would provide personal design services of a high quality to all the families. That's the overall picture. This week and next week we'll see how that develops. Originally, it's very clear, even if we don't know exactly what he means so far, it's very clear that God's intention was the 3 families stay together, that they work together. It's also very clear that they did not do that. The 3 families very, very quickly separated to all the world. In the next few weeks I'll show you there's always been interaction between the 3, and God always has His eye on all 3 families. If we understand the working together of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, we'll understand all of human history. So let's start to look at Genesis chapter 10. What we want to do is identify who those 3 families are. Who is Shem, who is Ham, and who is Japheth. Again, let me remind you, the document was written by Moses about 1450 BC. However, he reflects information about 3 or 4 generations after the flood, about 7500 BC. So the names we see here in Genesis chapter 10 are a snapshot of the world about the year 7500 BC. The reason I'm stressing that is, the names in this chapter, some of them would mean nothing to us, except for the fact that Herodotus, the Greek historian, writing about 500 BC, also writes a history of the world. And Herodotus writes a history of the world using the... He's not doing it on purpose, but he uses the same names we see in Genesis chapter 10. So, Herodotus gives us an update on what we find in Genesis 10. The reason I'm saying that is, then Josephus, the Jewish historian about the time of Jesus, starts writing a history of the world. And he now knows the names that he finds in Herodotus. So the point is, all these names in Genesis chapter 10, we can clearly identify who they are now because of that trace. Now we go to Genesis 10:1. Now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and sons were born to them after the flood. Starting point is in the mountains or the area of Turkey. That's where the 3 brothers started to repopulate the earth. And we begin with the family of Japheth. Genesis 10, remember who he was? He was the one who's going to be enlarged upon the earth, as he lived in the tents of Shem. The sons of Japheth were, and let me tell you the pattern. The pattern is that this author will list all the sons, and then he'll go back and zoom in. That's why I put some of these on charts. It's easier to follow that way. It's easier to follow it through that chart because he zooms back and forth between the sons. As we see who these sons are, we'll clearly identify who the family of Japheth is. First son is Gomer. Gomer settled in Central Europe. He moved from Turkey to Central Europe. And we still have his name as the name Germany. So if you are of German descent, you are descended from Gomer. This family, though, moved quickly. They settled in Germany, but then an offshoot of the Gomerians moved, and they moved to the area of the Basques. Historians don't know where the Basques came from. Between France and Spain, we do. Noah's son, Gomer. They kept moving. In fact, they moved across the English Channel. And they became the Scots and the Irish. The Scots and the Irish would never say they came from the same ancestor, but they did. They also became the Celts and the Welsh people, sort of the indigenous groups there of Great Britain, of England. So now, Gomer himself had 3 sons. Let's zoom down in on Gomer. Gomer's first son was named Ashkenaz. He settled in Eastern Europe, and he became the ancestor of the Czechs and the Poles. To this day, Jews whose families came out of Poland and Eastern Europe refer to themselves as Ashkenazi Jews. The Ashkenazis also moved quite a bit, and a branch of them, the branch of these Ashkenazis, moved all the way across Europe. They also went across the English Channel. They went to England, and the name Ashkenazi became the name Saxons. The next son of Gomer is Riphath. He settled in Central Europe, in fact, Switzerland. Riphath was a very famous man. In fact, he was called Good Riphath. So the prefix EU was placed before his name. So his name became EU Ripath. Euripath. Does that name sound familiar? Europe. He gave the name to the continent of Europe. Gomer's third son was Togarmah, and Togarmah settled in Turkey. And the reason it's important to know that is, in Ezekiel chapter 38, the end times prophecy, Togarmah figures in. So we need to know, by the way, we will get there in Revelation at some point. But actually, this is in Ezekiel 38. Now we know who Togarmah is. That's Turkey. That's Gomer. That's Japheth's first son. Japheth's second son was named Magog. Magog settled in the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia. The Magog became the Mongols of Genghis Khan. But primarily they became the main body of Russia. And of course, that will figure prominently in prophecy. So when we get to Ezekiel 38, 39, we see Gog and Magog. That's how we know that Magog is Russia. Japheth's third son was named Madai. M-A-D-A-I. Madai, of all places, went to India. To this day, there is a festival in India when they celebrate their origins, their cultural origins, and it's called the Feast of Madai. We even have the name reflected in the city called Madras. So, you see, Japheth basically settled Europe, didn't he? But he also is the father of the Indians, the Asian Indians. And, of all places, Madai's family also went to Iran and settled Iran. So the Iranians, you see, they're not Arabs. They're like us. Because Japheth was the father. By the way, when Noah said, "May Japheth be enlarged upon the earth," yes. He's the father of the Europeans, and basically then the Americans. The Europeans, the Asian Indians, and the Iranians. The Iranians, Farsi is a Indo-European language. It's a European language. That's why Iranians and Iraqis hate each other so much. Iraqis are Arabs. Iranians are not Arabs. They're Caucasians. Honey? Sorry?
Do a lot of them have blue eyes?
No, they don't have blue eyes. No. Well, they intermarried with so many other of Noah's sons. Yeah, so when Noah said, "May Japheth be enlarged upon the earth," absolutely. And Japheth, being the father of all these peoples, of all these ethnic groups, became not almost deified. He became a legendary person. And, in fact, his name was, we say Japheth in English, it was Japeter was his name. Japeter, which became Jupiter. Japheth's fourth son was named Javan. And Javan became the family or the nation of Rome, Italy, the Italians, and France. Charlemagne traced his ancestry back to Javan. And that name is still reflected in France, for example, as Jean, J-E-A-N. In Italy, it's even more clear that Javan became Giovanni. And now it became reflected in all these famous names we know, like John, Ivan, Ian, and Sean. And for women, Jean, Joan, Joan of Arc, Jeanne d'Arc. Now, these Javanites who settled in France, in 1066 A.D., under William the Conqueror, a descendant of Javan, they went across the English Channel to England, and that's how England became the nation that it is. It was a combination of those Celts and Saxons that came from Gomer and the French element that came from Javan. And of course that defined pretty much English culture, and that pretty much defined our culture and the Australians. Now Javan, obviously a legendary person too. The father of the French, the Italians, basically Western culture, Western civilization came from Javan. And he became legendary too, and Javan became the god Jove. People started to worship their ancestors. All right, now Javan, very influential person. He himself had 4 sons, and the first son of Javan is named Elisha. Actually, there's a rough breathing mark. Well, what that means is you put a letter H in front of Elisha, so it's Elisha. You know what nation he became the father of? Greece, that's right. Hellenic. He became the father of Greece. Tarshish. Do we know who Tarshish is? Yes, we do. Tarshish moved to Spain and Portugal and became the father of the Iberian people, the Hispanics. And of course that influenced America too, didn't it? Because those great explorers came from Tarshish. Kittim, the third son of Javan, became the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. Now that name will become very prominent for us when we get to Daniel chapter 11, because there's a prophecy about the Antichrist who will fear something that's happening in all places in Cyprus. So we have the foundation that Kittim in prophecy is the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean. Javan's 1, 2, 3, 4th son, the text says Rodanim, Rodanim, they settled in the Aegean Sea. In fact, specifically, this name will sound familiar, on the island of Rhodes, Rhodes. You've heard of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was the Colossus at Rhodes, a great statue at the harbor of the island of Rhodes. That's where they got the name and the people. But then, interestingly enough, this group of Rhodanes, they moved from the island of Rhodes to the mainland. In fact, they moved to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, just at the point of the France-Italy border, where a prominent river flowed into the Mediterranean at that point, and the Rhodanim gave their name to the Rhone River. The 5th son of Japheth was Tubal. Tubal, his family settled in eastern Russia, specifically Siberia, and their name is still reflected in the Siberian city called Tobolsky. Tobolsky, and again, when we get to Ezekiel 38 and 39, this is how we know that Tobolsky also refers to Russia. The 6th son of Japheth was named Meshech. Meshech is the ancient word for Moscow. So again, Ezekiel 38, 39 mentions Meshech. We know, that's how we know he's talking about Russia. The 7th son of Japheth was Tiras. And Tiras moved to Scandinavia and became the father of the Norwegians, Swedens, Denmarks, the Finns, and of course, I'm trying to assimilate a lot here, the Vikings. And from Tiras came the Angles and the Jutes, who also moved across the Channel to England and mixed with the Angles, the Saxons, and the French to further form the British culture. So you see, America, we talk about America, the great melting pot, yeah, big time. Look at everything we've seen that has streamed to form America. Also, we'll see the Ham has a presence with America. So Japheth, yes, he was certainly enlarged upon the earth. He was the father of the Europeans, the Indians, the Asian Indians, the Iranians. One other thing, it's very obvious that the Europeans and the Asian Indians were united. For one thing, there was clearly a common language. Linguists very easily can take the languages spoken like Farsi, the old ancient language of Sanskrit from the Middle East, Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and compare it with all the languages of Europe, and it's extremely clear they had a common ancestor. And that's why we can take documents written in Sanskrit and we can read them. It's the same language. It's the same culture. Any questions about Japheth before we move on? Then Noah's next son was his son Ham. The sons of Ham were Cush. That's Ethiopia. The second son was Mizraim, and that's Egypt. In fact, to this day, in Hebrew and Arabic, the word for Egypt is Mizraim. So you see, isn't this interesting? Accepted world history says about 7500 BC, pop, there's Egyptian culture. They don't know where it came from. I assure you they don't know. In fact, they say they don't know where it came from. We know where it came from, don't we? It was Noah's son Ham, his son Mizraim. That's where Egypt came from. The next son of Ham was Put, and that's Libya. Again, see, it's focusing on northern Africa so far. And Canaan. Now, that's the Middle East. Hold that thought. We'll come back to Canaan. Because now we want to go back to Cush. Genesis 10:7. We want to zoom in on Ham's son, Cush. Where did Cush settle? Ethiopia. But then his sons migrated from Ethiopia. Genesis 10:7, the sons of Cush were Seba and Havilah and Sabtah and Ramah and Sabteka, and the sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. The reason I went over those names quickly is that we don't know exactly where those individual sons went, but we do know that they settled Central Africa. So all those countries right in the core of Central Africa were settled by the sons of Cush. Now notice something. This is something we're going to build on the next few weeks. Those nations of Central Africa, this would be Kenya. Kenya on the east and Cameroon on the west. The Congo. He says they were settled by the sons of Cush, who settled Ethiopia. What does that mean? That means that Central Africa was settled as people moved into Africa. The reason I'm saying that is that accepted world history says that human beings came out of Africa. The Bible says human beings went into Africa from Turkey. See, there's a huge difference. Let me tell you something else. The accepted model will not account for this dilemma I keep talking about. What's the dilemma? Should I say it again? Yes, I will. The dilemma is that there is archaeological evidence for a civilization that's very high, very early. There is evidence for that, and the Bible says that's the way it was. But these scientists are not stupid. They're not ignoramuses. And when they say there were Stone Ages, Bronze Ages, Iron Ages, and there were Cro-Magnon men, call them whatever you want, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, they were there, we've seen the fossils. The Bible accounts for both of those lines of evidence, and accepted world history does not. If we accept the premise that human beings came from Turkey after the flood, then Cush went to Ethiopia, his descendants then settled Africa, that scenario will make all the evidence. So Cush was pretty active too. He was the father of the Ethiopians and the grandfather of the Central Africans. And then Cush had another very prominent son. Genesis 10:8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth, or his descendants did. Nimrod was very important. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. There's Babylon, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, the land of Shinar. That's the old Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. But I want to focus on Babel. There's the origin of Babylon. Accepted world history says about 7500 BC we have a kingdom called Babylon ruled by Nimrod. Yes, accepted world history says that. We don't know where he came from. Well, we do, don't we? He came from Ham, from Cush, and then Nimrod.
Is this the Tower of Babel?
This will be the group that will build the Tower of Babel. Yes. So far, Ham has settled northern Africa, central Africa. Well, now we want to zoom in to Canaan, to Palestine. Genesis 10:15, Canaan, who's Canaan? That's Ham's son, remember? He became the father of Sidon, his firstborn. So Canaan now has a son named Sidon. Sidon is still a city in Lebanon. And Lebanon, the ancient word for Lebanon was Phoenicia. Accepted world history says about 7500 BC we have a flourishing civilization on Phoenicia. Where is Phoenicia, by the way? Lebanon? It's on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Accepted world history says about 7500 BC there's a civilization of Phoenicia. We don't know where it came from. Well, we do. It came from Noah, Ham, Canaan, and Sidon. So Canaan also was pretty much enlarged too, wasn't he? Northern Africa, Central Africa. He's the Phoenicians. He's the Lebanese. And here's a very interesting son of Canaan, Heth. Heth became the father of a group called the Hittites. The Hittites were well known in the Middle East. However, their archaeological footprint in the Middle East is very small, and here's why. They didn't stay there very long. Very interesting, the Hittites are always pictured in drawings of that time as having pigtails and having almond-shaped eyes. And it's not accidental that that's the case, because they moved to the Far East. Very Far East. Hethe became Cathay. You ever read Marco Polo? When he traveled to the Far East to see the kings of the East, what he called China was Cathay. That came from Heth. But Heth's descendants did not actually establish China. Heth's descendants established Korea, Japan, and then those Southeast Asian nations. Vietnam, Laos, Kampuchea, Burma, Malaysia. those descendants of Heth will figure prominently in prophecy again as the kings of the east. So, Ham settled Africa, the very far east. Now we go back to Canaan in the Middle East. We go to Genesis 10, 16 through 17. We have the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites. Those are collectively called the Canaanites. And those are the tribes that Joshua had to conquer to settle the land. A couple more very interesting names in the line of Ham. We have the Arkite. The Arkites are very important to us because it was the Arkites who went all the way up to Siberia, but they kept on going across the Bering Strait into North America, South America, and they became the Aleuts. They became the Eskimos in very far North America. Their descendants kept moving down, and they came to what's now the United States, and what we call the American Indians came from the Arkites. In fact, most of the American Indians, they all have different languages, but they're all similar. They kept settled, they kept moving down, and they became the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas of Central and South America, and they became the Aborigines of Australia. So Ham got around too, didn't he? One more Hamite we got to account for, and this is very fascinating. In Genesis 10:17, the Sinite. There actually was a man named Sin, terrible coincidence, S-I-N, and he and his family settled in the Sinai Peninsula, giving their name to that, to Sinai. But his name was actually Shin, S-H-I-N. And Shin and his family moved, can you guess? They moved to China. Quickly. Shin, China. To this day, in fact, I saw in the paper the other day a headline about Sino-Soviet relationships. They're reflecting their old ancestors' name, the Bible records. Now again, accepted world history, about 7500 BC, there's China. They don't know where they came from. We do. It came from Noah. But we know where China came from. Noah, Ham, Canaan, and Shin. Now when Shin and his family moved to China, they took writing with them. It's very interesting that Egypt, who established Egypt? Ham, right? Ham's family. Who established China? What family? Ham. They have the same kind of writing. Hieroglyphic. Egyptian hieroglyphics and Chinese. Remember, not cuneiform. Cuneiform is right there in the central core of the world, and that's cuneiform, which has phonetic elements to it. Whereas you look at a word in cuneiform, if you don't know what it means, you can still say it. Whereas hieroglyphics, there's no sound attached to the symbols. It's just pictures. Now, Chinese became almost like collages. For a Chinese word will be like a box with all kinds of symbols in there, and you have to add them up to see what the word means in Chinese. What's interesting is that many of the symbols today, they don't even know what they mean anymore. They just write them as a word. Confucius, about the year 500 BC, started analyzing his own language and said, why do we have these odd characters in our words? What do they even mean? Confucius never answered his own question. He couldn't figure it out. Ethel Nelson, in the 1990s, she was a physician. She started analyzing those Chinese characters, and she came up with something remarkable. She found old biblical stories in the Chinese characters. For example, I put a couple of examples. The Chinese word for covet, to desire something, consists of the symbols for two trees and a woman. Does that sound familiar? There's a famous story involving coveting, involving two trees in a garden with a woman. How about the Chinese word for flood? The Chinese word for flood consists of the symbols for a boat with 8 people in it. Yeah. There's more. There's thousands of them. Let me give you just one more. The Chinese word for righteousness today consists of these drawings. There's a lamb over me. That's the word righteous in Chinese. Lamb over me. And the lamb has a sword piercing its side. Ethel Nelson found thousands and thousands of those, and she wrote the book. It's readily available if you want it. It's a fascinating book. It's absolutely astonishing book. She also refers to the fact that Confucius couldn't understand why did our ancestors, thousands of years ago, by the way, he said, my ancestor Chen, why did they worship a god named El Shaddai? They sound familiar? Sound like El Shaddai, doesn't it? Shin brought the knowledge of the God, the Creator, and the Gospel to China. The book is called Mysteries Confucius Couldn't Solve by Ethel Nelson. And it has been a great evangelistic tool for Chinese students to say, look what's in your own language. So Japheth settled Europe, India, Iran. He was enlarged upon the earth. Ham settled Africa and basically China. Now we go to Shem. Genesis 10:21. To Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Now that's an interesting name to point out in the line of Shem. And hold that thought, because I'm going to tell you in a minute why he points Eber out. Children were born. And again, he lists all the names. Then as you're going to zoom down, I would suggest you use the chart that I put there. Because let's focus on his sons Elam, Ashur, Lud, and Aram. Those became the countries of Syria and Assyria. But I want to focus on Arpachshad. 10:24. Arpachshad became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber. See, he keeps pointing out Eber for some reason. You know why? Put an H in front of that word, and you'll see that his name became the name for the Hebrews. Heber was a very important man. 10:25. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. What does that mean? Remember after the flood, the continents they were jolted apart violently. But you also remember they were not jolted apart totally like we have them today. I think maybe they were even visible. They could even see the other continents. Possibly. In Peleg's days, that divide continued on, and the continents moved apart to where they are today. I would say about 9,000 BC. So really, it was the time of the time of Peleg, when people became aware of these vast oceans. And the name Peleg is interesting, because this is one of those occasions when linguists have glimpses of the fact that there was an original language spoken by everybody, common to the world. Because the word Peleg became the Greek word for Pelagos, which means the sea. See, Peleg's days, the earth was divided, the sea formed, basically. Pelagos became the word sea. And do you know that we have the word in English, archipelago, which means in Greek, the first sea. What's interesting about this line? He stops it at Peleg. Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg. That line from Peleg led to Abraham to Jesus. But we'll come back to that. But remember now, Heber had 2 sons. One was Peleg, the other one was Joktan. Genesis 10:26-29. Joktan became the father of, check out these names, Almadad, Shelef, Hozermatheh, Jerah, Hadanaim, Uzal, Diklah, Obal, Amabiah, Sheba, Ophir, Hovilah, Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. Let me tell you where they settled. Saudi Arabia. Those are the Arabs. Put all this together. Shem is the father of the Jews and the Arabs. How ironic that is. They're the same family. Now notice, though, that accepted world history says that we have the Caucasians, the Africans, and the Orientals. Isn't that what people say? We have white people, the black races, and the Orientals. The Bible does not group them that way at all. The Bible groups together Europeans and Indians, Africans and Chinese, and Jews and Arabs. But let me stress, we'll see, the biblical picture accounts for what happened in human history, and the other one does not. Well, Genesis 10:32, he just stresses, these are the families of Noah by their nations. Out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. How could it be that we all look so different? I mean, we've just accounted here for Tiras, who came from Japheth, settled Scandinavia. Extremely white. Japheth's ancestor Tiras was a Scandinavian. Ham's descendants were the Central Africans, the very darkest of the dark. How could they have settled, how could they have descended from not just three brothers, but from one man, Noah? Here's the way I picture it. Shem, Ham, and Japheth would not have looked that much different. I believe that Ham was somewhat darker than the other two, but not substantially. Japheth was somewhat lighter skinned than the other two, and Shem would have been that olive Mediterranean type skin color. But then two things happened. Instead of staying together, the families went their own way, so those differences, which were slightly genetically different, became magnified, reinforced through intermarriage with other of the broad family. We had that, and also is the geography. You know, it could not be an accident that the lightest skinned people are the closest to the poles, and the darkest skinned people are the closest to the equator. That just cannot be a coincidence. So I think what happened was the brothers already had minor genetic differences in color, extremely minor, which were accentuated by intermarriage in the same broad family and where they moved geographically. Now, when I tell you that Genesis chapter 10 is an amazing document, now do you see why I say that? And do you see why it had to have supernatural revelation? Because there's not one person who could have been watching from a satellite and seeing all this happening, because they didn't have ways to communicate then. But do you realize we've accounted for everybody? Did I miss it? If I missed anybody, let me know. But I think you should have probably found yourself in there. By the way, I just skimmed the surface of this document. Of all the names and the records, I just barely skimmed the surface. It's a gold mine. In fact, if you want to know the whole human history, read these two things. Read four things. Genesis chapter 10, Daniel, Ezekiel starting in 38, and Revelation. You've got all of human history. Past, present, future. I want to close with one very important point. When I look at this outline here, it seems to me that some people are more fortunate spiritually than others. I look at this and I say, well, some people are obviously in a better situation to hear the gospel than others. Those tenths of Shem, the knowledge of Yahweh, I would say, Japheth, for example, Europeans, the Americans, I would say they're much better suited to get the gospel than the people in Central Africa. That's what I would say. That's not what God says. He says just the opposite. In fact, we have the commentary on Genesis chapter 10 in Acts chapter 17. Paul says, He made from one man. Actually, it says from one blood. And that's interesting. We all have the same blood. We talk about different races of man. There's just one race. There's three families, but there's just one race, human race, and it's all fallen. He made from one blood every nation, that means every ethnic group, every people, to live on all the face of the earth. And look, having determined, hold that thought, because that means not watching, He determined two things about every human being: their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. So that Genesis 10 I just went through with you, where they all settled, He says God determined that. But we can't stop there, because as we go on the next few weeks, we're going to see two things. One, obviously God intended them to stay together. That was His perfect will. And two, obviously they didn't. They scattered out. So we have this odd situation where God intended them to stay together, they did not, and then Paul says God determined where they would be. Why did He do that? Acts 17:27, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him. That's what people think, see. People think, well, I got to grope somewhere I can find God. Paul says, no. He's not far from each one of us. Each one of us means everybody in the world. So the amazing thing is this. All those places where I described people went, Australia, Central Africa, Paul is saying that God put every human being at a particular point in history and at a particular place in the world for him to have the best opportunity to be saved. That's what Paul just said. How can that be? I don't know. But it's supernatural. So again, whenever people say, what about the person who's never heard? It's always a guy in Africa, isn't it? What about the guy in Africa? Normally the guy in Africa had a totem pole. What about him? All I know is what Paul said. He said, God predetermined where they would be, when they would be, so that that person would have the best opportunity to be saved. If you want to know how it works, I don't have a clue. But for our application, God's will not be thwarted. And again, remember, His perfect will was that they work together. We'll see that. That was clearly His will. Let Japheth be enlarged, let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Ham provide technical design services. Clearly there's a picture that they worked together, and clearly they did not. They scattered out. Paul says that was his will. What a great picture for our lives, because here's the pattern for our lives. God does have a perfect will for our lives. It involves every second of our lives what we do. He has a perfect decreed will. Point number 2 is we depart from it every day. We probably rarely hit it. Point 3, God brings us back. Point 4, and this is the most important. When He brings us back, then He puts His stamp on what we did, those detours we took. He puts His stamp on what we did and says, that was all my will. Yes. He doesn't just bring us back to His will and say, well, okay, although you departed from my will, I brought you back. That'd be good enough, wouldn't it? If He just said, although you departed from my will, I brought you back, I would take that in a second. It's more than that. He says, what you did, those detours you took, He says, I stamped my decree on those. That was my will. Now, to us, it's retroactive from our perspective. But it's not really retroactive because He doesn't live in time. And you see, that's exactly what happened here. He wanted them to stay together. They did not. They separated out, and God says, ha, 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 my will not be thwarted. He put His stamp on what they did and said, I decreed that they went all those places when they were outside His will. His will won't be thwarted. Well, that's a complete picture of the world about the year 7500 BC. And you see, every nation's now accounted for. But you notice something missing? We didn't find any place for stone, bronze, iron ages. We didn't find any place for Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal. Where are they? That's where we're going to keep going.
About who He is and how to have a...
Yes, and that's the primary way that no one can say they never heard. But it struck me this week He's saying something even more than that. Because if all a primitive Australia had was creation, I would still say he had less opportunity to hear the gospel than I did growing up in a Southern Baptist church. Father, again, we thank You for Your Word. We thank You for this amazing document where You have given an account of where everybody in the world came from. And what an amazing lesson for our lives, that clearly the 3 families strayed from Your will immediately. And yet You not only reconciled them all, You said the whole time they were straying, that was my will too. We thank You that You were sovereign. We thank You that You were sovereign over all the events of our lives, even when we stray from Your will daily. Above all, we thank You for Jesus, who brought us into a covenant relationship with You by His sacrificial, substitutionary death on the cross on our behalf. And we thank You in His name this morning.
In His hands, got the world in His hands. In His hands, got the world in His hands. In His hands, got the world in His hands. He's got the whole 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 world in His hands. He's got the wind and the rain in His hands. He's got the wind and the rain in His hands. He's got the wind and the rain. In his hands, he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the tiny little baby. In his hands, he's got the tiny little baby. In his hands, he's got the tiny little baby. In his hands, he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother. In his hands, he's got you and me, sister. In his hands, he's got you and me, brother. In his hands, he's got the whole world in his